Good afternoon and welcome to the New York Society for Ethical Culture. My name is Dr. Ann Clayson and I'm a leader here at this society, which was started in 1876 by Felix Adler, whose portrait hangs over there on the wall. He was much younger when he started ethical culture. He was only 25. And I often say now that my children are older than that, I'm very appreciative and much in awe of someone who could start this radical new non-theistic religion of ethics at such a young age. Ethical culture is a religious and philosophical movement that is congregationally organized and promotes the primacy of ethical values and ideals in all relationships of life, independent of theological foundations. It's about engagement with people and entities outside of oneself. It is outward-looking and active, and ethical culture is a dynamic philosophy that puts us into engaged activity with other people and the environment in which we live, which is why we are so delighted to host this panel today. And I want to let you know that our congregation was very much a presence at Occupy Wall Street. And as those of you who occupied Zuccotti Park know, that during that time, dozens of working groups started, and after the eviction, there were over 80 working groups, and one of those is Occupy Faith, of which I'm very proud to be a member. Occupy Faith is an interfaith community here in New York City. It is spread across the country, and we believe that it's important for us as clergy and as members of various faith traditions to stand up for social justice, and that certainly includes economic justice. I'll just leave you with this thought. Felix Adler did not support a minimum wage, he supported a maximum wage. And so now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Cassidy. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, I'm John Cassidy from the New Yorker. Thanks for coming. As you can see, we've got a very large panel, so try to get on to it very quickly. I'd just like to thank the New York Society for Ethical Culture and the Rockefeller Foundation for helping to make this event work. As you all know, we should know, we're here to mark the publication of this book, which Janet Byrne, who's in the room somewhere, put together, a collection of more than 50 articles on various aspects of Occupy Wall Street. Not really so much about the actual events, although there's a bit of that, but more about the intellectual debates which the movement has sparked. I had my say on these things in Washington yesterday, where there was another event along these lines. So I'm going to, in order to make the thing go along quickly, I'll keep my thoughts to myself today. The only thing I would, I'm trying to elicit some from the panel. The only thing I would say is, to me, it just seems that Occupy Wall Street sort of its emergence is a symptom of what a fascinating and sort of open period in history which we're living in. You know, if you think about it in sort of big picture terms, as journalists like to do, the sort of 60s and 70s discredited the idea of a sort of all-efficient government, and the 90s and zeros did a very good job of discrediting the idea of an all-efficient market. So what's to replace both of those ideologies, I think, remains to be seen. Occupy Wall Street's obviously part of the discussion. And I think that's why, you know, it's not just a protest movement. It does go to a lot of very interesting economic and political debates. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Irons, who's Managing Director of the Rockefeller Foundation, and he's going to frame the debate. Thanks.
Great, thanks, John. So I'm just going to take a couple minutes quickly just to frame the debate a little bit. So first, I'd like to welcome you to the panel today on economics and Occupy Wall Street. Let me start by thanking Janet Byrne, who organized the panel today, and I'd also like to thank the New School and the New York Society for Ethical Culture for hosting the event. The Rockefeller Foundation is pleased to be able to support these important discussions. Over our 99-year history, the foundation has supported innovative research into some of the world's most pressing problems. In this spirit, we welcome the public discussion today and on other days spurred by the Occupy movement. Before we get to the panel, I want to take a moment to note the remarkable set of contributors to the Occupy Handbook, some of whom are here today. They include award-winning economists, researchers, and journalists, activists and union leaders, experts on Wall Street, and experts on Main Street. They bring a remarkable depth of knowledge, perspective, and insight into the causes and consequences of inequality. And the work is also a reminder that issues of economic inequality are not new. They are, in fact, very, very old. People have been struggling with these issues for centuries. So yesterday I was trying to dig up some good quotations about economic inequality from long-dead presidents, from notable economists, and others. If you do a Google search for income inequality, you get about 4 million hits. It's no Lady Gaga, but there's a lot of hits out there on the topic. Let me kind of throw out a couple, right? Teddy Roosevelt's 1910 speech in Kansas has some good nuggets in there. For example, he said, "In every wise struggle for human betterment, one of the main objects, and perhaps the only object, has been to achieve, in large measure, equality of opportunity." Adam Smith has a chapter in The Wealth of Nations on the topic. If you're having trouble sleeping one night, you might look to chapter 10. It's called Of Wages and Profit in the Different Employments of Labor and Stock, and it's much better than a warm mug of milk, I guarantee it. And you can all go all the way back to Plato if you want. So these are not new issues. Plato wrote, "Any city, however small, is in fact divided into two. One the city of the poor, the other of the rich." But let me also turn to the contributors of the handbook and note a common thread across many of the essays in the book, as well as in the movement itself, namely the link between economics and politics. As Acemoglu and Robinson note in their essay, countries that have succeeded in creating egalitarian, economically dynamic societies have done so because they have forged inclusive political institutions. Krugman and Wells write, "Soaring inequality is at the root of our polarized politics." And in their essays, Paul Volcker asks us to occupy K Street, and Robert Reich asks us to occupy our democracy. Now, these are just the pointy-headed economists. You can imagine what some of the others have said in the book as well. On the pure economic side, it's very easy to get caught up in the details of Gini coefficients, optimal tax theory, credit default swaps, but at its core, it's really much simpler. In an interview back in 1997, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Ken Arrow put it plainly. He said, "I find inequality to be in and of itself objectionable." He continued, "The mere fact that members of the same community should differ so much is a bothersome thing. That doesn't mean that every inequality can be rectified. Sometimes a cure creates problems that are worse than the disease. But it does mean that inequality is a problem you want to address if you can." As I said earlier, issues of economic and political inequality are not new. But while they are old problems, we need to look for new solutions in the 21st century. So I'll just turn to the panel now, and I won't bother listing the accomplishments. If I did, we'd be here all night. But let me just make one personal note. Bob Solow was a professor of mine when I was in graduate school. He taught me a lot about growth theory. Most people know him for his growth theory, for which he won the Nobel Prize. But the year he was supposed to teach me, he decided to go ahead and not retire, but he became, I believe it was called an institute professor, which meant he didn't have to teach. So a group of students barged into his office and demanded that he indeed keep teaching the course he had taught for so many years. So I suppose I need to thank him for continuing to teach and to apologize for ruining perhaps his first year of retirement. So I'll turn it back over to John Cassidy.
Thanks very much, John. Just a note to my fellow panelists here. Because it's such a large panel, we really are going to try and insist on keeping it to 5 minutes each, please. So I'll let you know when we get to 5 minutes just by interrupting you. And if you go on for another minute, more than another minute or so, I'll adopt some New York City Police Department tactics and get my taser gun out. Anyway, so the first speaker today, who's already been talked about, is of course the great economist Robert Solow from MIT. Professor?
Thanks. You should know that I'm here as a pinch hitter. My friend and colleague Peter Diamond, who contributed a chapter to the book, was supposed to be here, but came down with a herniated disc and has a bad back, and so here I am instead. We're here because, as you all know, there has been in recent years, in recent decades, a really substantial increase in inequality, in income inequality in the U.S. and elsewhere, but we're talking about the U.S. This has happened, by the way, keep this in mind, because the top incomes, the 1%, has run away from the middle, not because the bottom 1% or 5% has fallen behind the middle. So the source of this increase in inequality is something that has happened to top incomes. And we can, I think, trace it a little further than that. Much of what has happened to inequality at the top, has happened because of a real explosion of compensation to high and second-level participants in the financial services industry. And I'm going to give you an illustration of that in a moment. The financial services industry is not small, remember that. As recently as 1980, financial firms earned about 15% of all corporate profits in the U.S. In 2006, they earned 40%, roughly, of all corporate profits in the U.S., fell dramatically during the meltdown, but I noticed that in 2011, it's creeping back up near 40% again. Now, it's simple, fairly simple to follow what has happened to compensation at the top of the financial services industry. And in particular, I have a graph that you can't see, but that I will tell you about. Someone has looked at the median compensation of the CEOs of the broker-dealer firms in the U.S. You know, the Goldman Sachs's and the Morgan Stanleys and the late Merrill Lynch and the late Lehman Brothers and so on. Compare that with the median compensation of the CEOs of ordinary commercial banks, banks that do nothing but accept deposits and make loans, and compare that in turn with the median compensation of the CEOs of the non-financial corporations in the S&P 500. And what you find if you look at that is that up until about 1985, there's nothing to choose. All three groups of CEOs, on the average, get compensated at about the same level. They're not impoverished, mind you, but at about the same level. Then there begins to be some divergence. And sometime around the mid-1990s, there is an absolute eruption. And for the next 7 or 8 or 10 years, the CEOs of the broker-dealer firms, the big investment banks, the ones that I mentioned, earn about 10 times the average compensation of the CEO of an industrial company, and about 5 to 7 times the average compensation of the CEO of a commercial bank. So something big happened there, and it had a lot to do with the explosion of inequality. Now, it's simply not possible to believe that that just after 1995, let's say, the broker-dealer firms, the big financial firms, suddenly began to create something of enormous social value that they were not creating before. That's the normal justification that we give in society for people who haul down very large incomes, that they are, after all, contributing something of importance, not to themselves, but to not only to themselves, but to the society. It's simply utterly implausible that suddenly some magic occurred in 1995 and lasted until the meltdown. And the natural presumption is what those CEOs and their firms were creating was a way of using superior information and perhaps superior analytic capacity to transfer wealth from those with inferior information and inferior analytical capacity. I leave aside the fact that they were also creating a catastrophe. Now, suppose you thought that with that in mind, with the fact that the normal justification that these are not captains of industry in the heroic sense, that it would be a good idea to tax away a more substantial part of those very high incomes, 1% incomes or 1/10 of 1% incomes, than we now do, and use the revenue proceeds for some good social purpose, whatever that purpose might be. It might be debt reduction, federal debt reduction. It might be to improve the well-being of the bottom 1 or 5%, or it might be to build bridges to somewhere. But suppose that you had the notion of doing that. Why shouldn't you? Why shouldn't we? The normal explanation, the normal reason that is given to be cautious about this is that high tax rates, say 50 or 70%, as against the roughly 35% that is the top marginal rate on the federal income tax right now, might lead to the withdrawal of effort, might lead the earners of those incomes to supply less effort, and with the talents of very productive people being removed from the economic process, would actually cost society something. Now, you have to grant that might be true.
Wrap it up, please, Professor.
Okay, I got about a minute and a half to go here. That might be true of some people. I imagine there are risk-taking innovators who might respond negatively in that way. There are also some people of whom it is certainly not true. You know as well as I that LeBron James or Alex Rodriguez would continue to play basketball or shortstop if they and everyone else paid a higher marginal tax rate. They earn rents. There is nothing else for them to do. The important thing for you to remember is that although there has been a lot of research on this issue, there is no serious evidence that increases in marginal tax rates result in the reduction of effort, reduction in the supply of effort by those whose tax rates rise, particularly at the upper end of the income distribution. Peter Diamond and Emmanuel Saez, whose paper appears in the book, in the Occupy Handbook book, made a standard economic calculation that I could not do for you here because A, I have no time, and B, I have no blackboard, and I desperately need a blackboard. Make a calculation of what marginal tax rate on the upper 1% would maximize the revenue from the tax system. And their answer is that it comes out something between 50 and 70%. We are now at 35%, less if you consider all incomes, and we are not about to increase it, and that's a problem for all of us.
Thank you very much, Professor. Great. The next speaker is Martin Wolf, longtime economics columnist and writer, leader writer, various other offices at the FT. Been covering the financial crisis since the very beginning and has provided invaluable coverage for years. Martin, over to you.
First of all, it's a tremendous pleasure and a great honor to be here. It's also a bit peculiar, since you've probably already worked out that I'm not American, and this starts off with Occupy Wall Street. And furthermore, I work for an organ that surely must be regarded as almost as much a pillar of capitalism as the Wall Street Journal. So there must be a question about what on earth I'm doing here. The answer, of course, is that I was invited. And so I was invited to contribute to the book, and I was invited to contribute to the panel. It was a great honor and pleasure to contribute to the book, and it's an honor and pleasure to be here. Why do I think the subject is important? Well, my view is very simple. Those of us, and I count myself as one, who believe in market economies and also believe in the virtues of an active, engaged citizenry in a democratic society, will perceive, because it really isn't very difficult, that something has gone pretty seriously wrong. And not just in the US, but also to a substantial degree in other Western democratic countries. And it's gone wrong in at least two fundamental respects, which are, I think, linked, but I don't have time to discuss the links, to the stability of the system and to the justice of the system, which Bob just discussed. Now, my conclusion, and really the starting point of my essay, is we are in one of those times, and these times, as has already been pointed out, have occurred before at the beginning of the last century and in the 1930s and onwards into the post-war period, when we need rather radical reforms to protect, as I see it, the market from politics and politics from the market. Or in other words, to work out a better, more just, more reasonable relationship between the two than we have had over the last 3 decades. I think the cause is important for all those who believe, broadly speaking, in what I think of as liberal democracy. Now, I see the process of reform to which my essay is addressed as a permanent feature of any dynamic market and democratic society. The things go wrong, ideas are tried, ways of operation develop which are fundamentally dysfunctional, and there is always a point at which redress is required. We happen to be in one of those periods. That's why I related it to the beginning of the last century and the middle of the last century. We are in one of those periods when the redress that is required is, I think, very large, because things have gone wrong in these two absolutely fundamental respects. We have an extremely unstable world economic system, and one that is obviously generating quite extraordinary inequalities, which are, I think, corroding democratic legitimacy in quite fundamental ways. Whatever we do will almost certainly have to be redone or undone or changed in future generations. As I said, this is a permanent process, a permanent dialogue. Now, with that as the background, I've addressed, and I clearly don't have the time to go through it, but I've addressed 7 topics, which seems quite heroic in 3,000 words, but then I'm a journalist, that's what I'm supposed to be able to do. Every line I treat as I consider a sort of an agenda for discussion. But the topics, I think, are absolutely central. So it's not just, in my view, about inequality. It's about macroeconomic stability and stabilization policy after the clear failure of the dominant orthodoxies in terms of monetary and macroeconomic policy in the lead up to the crisis and the inadequate response to the crisis. It is about the financial system in particular, which Bob touched upon, and the profoundly perverse incentives, principal agent and asymmetric information problems. This is a book about economics, in the financial sector. And I have a number of proposals for dealing with that, including vastly higher capital requirements, a complete transformation of the way people are paid. I think all senior managers should be paid in junior debt, which they cannot, which they must hold for at least a decade after they receive it. Their interests must be aligned with those with creditors, not of shareholders. I discuss inequality. Some of that's been discussed. I touch upon the tax system, all our tax systems. The US is merely egregious, but all our tax systems are profoundly inefficient and
5
unjust.
minutes, Martin.
Yeah, and I've got through 4. I've only got 3 to mention. So the tax systems need radical reform. A very big issue, in my view, is the role of money in politics, where I think the US is in a class of its own and has developed a completely dysfunctional democratic system as a result. And finally, I discuss, because this I think is a global issue, the way national capitalism and global and it should operate within a global context. Globalization is not going to go away, and that means more global governance. The one thing that worries me about some of the discussions that are going on around this topic is the idea that all this can be solved nation by nation by closing up the borders. I think that will be both wrong and unjust, but that creates profound challenges in global governance. We have to reconsider the way we are designing our economies and societies. Do I think all this will happen? No. I'm not that naive. Do I think the agenda is really serious and significant for us in the West? Yes, I'm absolutely sure it is. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on the agenda is me, but I'm skipping. If anybody wants to ask me about the 2012 election and Occupy Wall Street, I'd be happy to answer it in questions, but we've got so many speakers that we should move along. Next speaker is Bethany McLean, who is a journalist who actually knows how Wall Street works, having worked there, I think, to start off with, and has written at least 2 very good books, one on Enron and one on the financial crisis. So Bethany, over to you.
So I'll start with a warning, which is that I hate public speaking, so I still do what I did in grade school, which is talk as fast as I can in an effort to get it over with as quickly as possible. One of the things that has struck me as really disheartening in the wake of the crisis is how politicized it's become. And in certain quarters, there's a very easy explanation for what went wrong, which is that this is all a story of government policies to encourage homeownership gone wrong. And I can't tell you the number of times people have come up to me and said, see, this is what happens when you give people who can't afford houses. But the fascinating thing to me is that subprime lending was never about homeownership. It was cover for a whole lot of practices that had nothing to do with homeownership, even though from the very beginning it was sold as enabling homeownership. One community activist I spoke to said to me that as early as the 1990s, lenders were pushing back against the regulation of subprime lending by saying, well, this is how people qualify for homes. But this community activist said, I don't even think they believe that. The conflation of subprime lending and homeownership goes back to the very beginning. There were a series of laws passed in the 1980s and early 1990s that were supposed to help homeownership. They changed lending, they enabled the creation of mortgage-backed securities, and the idea was that America was going to face a deficit of homes, and so we needed to do everything we can to make homes available. But immediately these rule changes were used by a new breed of lenders, not to enable homeownership, but to enable people to cash equity out of their homes. And this is, of course, a story of people, like all business stories are. And there's a company called Guardian that was run by this flashy couple called the Jednacks, and a regulator at the Office of Thrift Supervision later said about Guardian, ground zero, baby, because they would offer anybody who could qualify for a loan, anybody who had a pulse, a mortgage, as long as that person had equity in their house. And the idea was, who cares if you defaulted, because the lender would just take the house, and therefore they didn't have to care what happened to you. The Guardian was followed by a guy named Roland Arnall, who's just a fascinating character. Up from nothing, he started selling flowers on the streets of Los Angeles, and he became one of the richest men in the country with a fortune of an estimated $3 billion. And he started a company called Long Beach Mortgage, which was later sold to Washington Mutual and basically took Washington Mutual down. But Long Beach Mortgage was also about enabling people to cash equity out of their homes. And Roland Arnall's subsequent company called AmeriQuest became the biggest subprime lender in the country by 2004. AmeriQuest never offered home purchase loans. All they offered were so-called cash-out refinancings, where people take a mortgage out that's bigger than their original mortgage and pocket the difference in cash. A company called New Century, which many of you in this room may know, also one of the biggest subprime lenders, in 2004 actually told Congress that 2/3 of their business had nothing to do with homeownership. It was all cash-out refinancing so that people could get money that they needed for other things, whether frivolous things or important things like education and medical expenses. And very ironically, this is a somewhat geeky point, but for those of you in the audience who have followed the Fannie and Freddie debate, a lot of people have also said, well, Fannie and Freddie are responsible for the crisis because that way government is to blame, the government did it. But this New Century executive also told Congress, well, you need us because Fannie and Freddie actually won't enable they won't let people take the amount of equity out of their homes that we private lenders will. And there's some fascinating data from 2000 to 2007 in almost every year, about 60% of subprime mortgages were cash-out refis. And the same basic statistics are true for another class of risky mortgages called Alt-A loans. So the crisis is not a referendum on homeownership. Whatever else it is, if you had limited risky loans to first-time buyers of homes, we never would have had a crisis. What I think it is a referendum on, and economists could probably do better work on this than I can, but in my sloppy journalistic way, it just seems to me that we're in trouble if we have a consumer-driven economy, a consumer spending-driven economy where where a wide swath of consumers can't afford to spend. You can, of course, take this to a
5 minutes, Bethany.
You can, of course, take this to a different level. Oh my God, I can't believe I got to five minutes. You can take this to a different level, which is the Wall Street view of the world, which is that the whole crisis was a deficit of personal responsibility. I'm somewhat sympathetic to this argument, I have to admit. I think without personal responsibility, we're lost. But I also think that a world where personal responsibility where the cry of personal responsibility becomes a substitute for any other kind of morality is also a really, really big problem. And there's too much of a view in our financial community now that, well, if people sign on the dotted line, hey, as long as they agree to it, then that's morality. That's the answer. And so I think we're in trouble with a consumer spending-driven society where people can't spend, and I think we're in a society that uses the ethos of a personal responsibility as a dodge for any other kind of morality is also in trouble. And a historian, I'm sure, could have tons of fun with that one. So.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is a columnist, David K. Johnston, tax columnist at Reuters. Many of you will know him from his career at the New York Times, where he wrote a lot about inequality before inequality was fashionable. In fact, you've probably heard a lot about, I think Bob Solow mentioned Emmanuel Sayers and Thomas Piketty, who are getting a lot of publicity, including an article in the New York Times yesterday for how the top 1% have been taking an ever-increasing share of income. I seem to remember David doing something very similar in the Times about 10 years ago, so perhaps the Times should be writing articles about him. Anyway, I'll hand it over.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. A society is defined by its rules. And in America, the economic rule book has been rewritten for the benefit not of the top 1%, which starts at, after all, only about $30,000 a month of income, but the top 1% of the top 1%. And if you doubt that, here's a little number for you. In 2010, all the increased income in America, 37% of it went to 15,600 households. Everything has rules. Baseball, lots of fun, trivial activity. The rules in baseball go right down to how many stitches are on the ball and what color the yarn is. We have created a society in which the rules take from the many and give to the few. And the news media has largely missed this story. And I'll give you several examples of this. Last week, I broke the news that 16 states have passed laws that allow 2,700 large corporations, every brand name company you know, Goldman Sachs, General Electric, Procter & Gamble, to keep the state income taxes withheld from the workers at their factories in those states. I'll say it again. 2,700 companies get to pocket the state income taxes withheld from their workers' paychecks. Nobody knew about this. I have since last week found 3 more states that have passed these laws, not one of which was written about by any journalists. 3 weeks ago, I broke the story that AT&T and Verizon are quietly getting repealed, the 99-year-old guarantee, legal guarantee that everyone in America has to a landline telephone at any address in America. 5 states have already repealed these laws. No news coverage except in the Lexington Herald in Kentucky and in my column in Reuters. We have, from the Bush era, a regulation that allows the pipeline industry, which is exempt from paying the corporate income tax, they are allowed to include the corporate income tax in the rates they charge. So every time you put gas in your car or turn on your stove to boil water for coffee, you pay a tax that does not exist in law, and it increases the ultimate returns to the owners of these pipelines by as much as 75%. And by the way, some of these monopolies, which are supposed to be regulated by the government, earn an annual return on assets of over 50%. The average for all American companies is 6.7. We have adopted rules that have taken away from individuals the right to collectively bargain, and you now see this playing out in state governments. What kind of market has an 18-year-old freshly minted high school student competing against a company in negotiating pay when that company has years of experience, lawyers, economists, and other experts to tell it what the young person doesn't know? The fact is that we have just created in America a society in which we do not have any more competitive market economics. And I'm a big fan of competitive markets. I'm also the founding chairman of a small company with 25 workers, so I get to say job creator. Instead, we have created a society in which, unbeknownst to people, their rights have been taken away. They have had taxes imposed on that they have no idea about. Their tax dollars are being diverted at an enormous rate. If you walk into a Walmart, a Lowe's, or other large modern retail stores, there's roughly a 1 in 3 chance that the store is technically owned by government and that the sales tax that you are required to pay at the cash register is kept by the owners of the store to pay the government so that it can own the store once it has collected enough in taxes. And I've documented how these are driving small entrepreneurial businesses out of business.
5 minutes, David.
The reality of what we live in America today is a reality in which corporations, which began under the Romans in service to the state, we now live in a society where the state exists to serve corporations. The Citizens United decision, which is completely ahistorical. At the founding of this country, corporations were allowed to exist for a single purpose for 20 years, and you had to prove you served a public purpose by your existence, are, under our Supreme Court, now granted political rights. Well, Citizens United is to the expansion of corporate power what the Big Bang was to the singularity. It's the whole universe. And if we don't get a handle on this and react, which is why I'm glad to see that people are responding in the Occupy movement, I will guarantee you one thing will come sooner rather than later. Young people will sit down in high school and pick up a history book with a chapter that will begin with these words: the United States of America was.
Okay. Thank you very much, David. The next speaker is Jeff Madrick, another journalist who's got a distinguished record of writing about inequality and the issues raised by Occupy Wall Street for a long period. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books and a former economics columnist at the New York Times. Jeff?
Thank you, John, and thank you, Janet, for putting together this fine book. Appreciate being here. I'm going to talk a little bit differently. I'm not so sure Occupy Wall Street was about inequality so much as it was about injustice. You don't find injustice in too many economics textbooks, but I think that's what drove these young people, and some not so young people, to sit in. That's what drove the anger. a sense of frustration that many people were treated unfairly in America. Now, what strikes me as most remarkable in this period is to compare the current discussions we're having and the actions taken to what happened after and during the Depression. The Great Depression of the 1930s was a watershed period, both for economics and for social policy. One would have expected that a similar, if not as severe, financial crisis and economic recession, an ongoing recession in Europe, would have generated something of a similar watershed event. We have had some soul-searching among economists. We have had some soul-searching among journalists and among policymakers. But we really haven't gotten too far when you think about it. Why is that? In fact, almost the opposite is occurring. What I would call a right-wing re-ascendancy in economic theory has taken over. After the Depression, we began to recognize that government spending was necessary to pull us out of the depths of high unemployment and severe depression. For a moment, we returned to that idea. We had an Obama stimulus. We had significant monetary ease, and so forth. We have now returned to a period of austerity, severe, almost remarkable in Europe as an example of history, and I think one that will live in infamy if we are able to look back with any rationality at it. But we also have a rise of austerity economics in the US. Why? What's going on here? I link this to OWS because the question I think we all have to ask is, economists have been talking about inequality for a very long time. In fact, to some degree, they even got it right long before the financial crisis. Why did it require the efforts of OWS to have Washington listen more closely, to have policymakers listen more closely? It's a serious challenge to our democracy, the failure to be able to listen. And when people don't listen in Washington, when Democrats and Republicans are so much aligned that there is not that significant a difference, although I grant the ascendancy of Tea Party economics has opened up a gap between the center and the right. But when the main parties are basically centrist and no one's listening, people stop talking, they stop believing, they don't understand, and I think OWS touched deep frustration in America. I do not talk very much about inequality per se because I don't think inequality is the right way to describe what's happened in America. It's stagnation of incomes or near stagnation of income for the vast majority with, as Bob Solow suggested, a runaway at the top, which didn't have to do so much with the non-financial economy as it did with games and unethical games often that people played on Wall Street. A study by Bakija and others about the top 0.1% makes very clear that it was financial incomes and CEO and manager incomes tied to stock options, which in turn were tied to stock prices, that accounted for the large majority of income increases in the top 0.1%. This was a challenge for democracy. It's a challenge indeed that economists have to think about. Why weren't economists more effective? And indeed, and let me be a little bit more challenging, weren't economists more angry before the crisis about the lack of transparency? A good old-fashioned Hayekian,
5 minutes, Jeff.
Hayekian principle, the lack of transparency in derivatives. Without information, markets can't possibly work. The conflicts of interest in ratings agencies, the asymmetric financial incentives that rewarded risk and hardly penalized losses. Now, you might say, do economists ever really have that much power? Well, look at their power over issues like free trade. So there's a challenge out here for economists to talk louder, to step up, to fight the battles, but there's a challenge to America. Why did right-wing economics take over? And I think probably the culprit we've got to talk about, the abstract culprit, is we are becoming a class society and an oligarchy run by wealthy vested interests who dominate Wall Street, who dominate Washington. That's the issue, I think, for me, OWS raises most poignantly.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Jeff. There's a challenge to economists there. We have two more very distinguished economists to speak penultimately and last. First up, Raghuram Rajan, who's professor at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Lots of people claim to have predicted the financial crisis. Raghu's one of the few people who can actually point to some evidence in his defense for that. Famous paper he gave in 2005 at a Federal Reserve conference raising the possibility of a big financial crisis. He's also the author of a very good 2010 book on the role that inequality and stagnant wages played in driving a lot of the sort of underlying forces that laid behind the crisis and the sort of lending in the crazy lending in the housing market. So Raghu, over to you. And again, guys, if you can keep it to 5 to 7 minutes, that would be great.
Thank you, John. So I want to move away from the financial sector. I think we're all agreed there were deep problems in the financial sector. Pay was perhaps excessive, was probably excessive, and there was too much risk-taking. But the financial sector is not the sole cause of inequality. It's a bigger issue, and I want to move on to that. So where does this inequality that we're all worried about come from? One possible argument is its governance. It's not just the financial sector. It's bigwigs across the corporate sector who are earning too much. Well, think about the group which is most represented in the top 1%. Turns out it's a group which typically doesn't run corporations. I mean, guess who it is? Which is the group that's in the top 1%, the most represented? It's not the financial sector. It's doctors. Doctors are the single highest earners as a group in the United States. Okay? So that tells you that perhaps this is more than about corporate misgovernance or excessive wages to the CEOs. In fact, if you look at the CEOs and their wages relative to the rest of the top 1%, the top 0.1%, top 0.1% is not just CEOs, it's a whole bunch of people outside. Well, CEOs, this is work that my colleague Steve Kaplan has done. CEOs don't particularly earn much more than other people in the top 0.1%. So there is something general which is pushing up wages up there, and it's not just corporate misgovernance. And what do economists have to say about this? Well, some of the smartest economists who worked on this would point to two forces. I'd add a third. The two forces they'd point to, this is, for example, Claudia Golden and Larry Katz from Harvard, talk about technology. The fact is, technology has increased tremendously, and therefore, the kinds of skills that you need to work with that technology have also increased. And unfortunately, in the United States, they haven't kept pace. We haven't got enough people emerging from the colleges with bachelor's degrees, but more than bachelor's, master's, and PhDs to use the kind of technology that is being produced. And that technology, in a sense, has created a hollowing out of the middle. So the clerk who used to add up left-hand side and right-hand side of the balance sheet is no longer needed. A computer can do it. That job we used to pay pretty decent wages is gone. So what happens is the more creative people and the people who can't be replaced because they do drudge work, which cannot be replaced by machine, those are the kinds of jobs that are emerging. The middle is hollowing out. That's a problem. Second, globalization. Clearly, even smart people are to some extent facing competition, from the rest of the world. A lawyer today can be, in a sense, replaced by a lawyer in the Philippines at 1/10 the wages. So globalization is also having an effect, again, on jobs that can be done at a distance relative to jobs that can be done nearby. The third factor, which I think we pay less attention to, is the fact that in the United States, in the UK, there's been tremendous deregulation. And if you look at the financial sector, Thomas Philippon at NYU has done this. The salaries in the financial sector keep pace with deregulation. The salaries as well as the educational qualifications. So what happened in the pre-depression era? Salaries were going up. The qualifications of people who went into the financial sector were also going up. Then you had regulation, which meant you couldn't do very much. People left the financial sector, salaries went down, qualifications went down. Starting in the 80s, you deregulated again, salaries went up, qualifications went up. Is this a bad thing? Yes. Carried to excess, it's a terrible thing. But in general, deregulation creates more competition, draws more talented people, creates more returns to talent to some extent. So I would add deregulation as the third factor. So in a sense, if these are underlying economic forces rather than just Bush tax cuts or it's the bad governance, the solutions have to be a little more thoughtful than just let's tax the hell out of the top 0.1%. And I would argue that the kinds of solutions we need are really extremely difficult to implement, and we need to start doing them today. We need better access to education, because if in a sense you're going to get a good job only if you're well educated, we need to work on that much harder. And it's not just better schools, it's better communities, it's better access to healthcare. It's the whole process of taking a child from birth to college. We need to work on every aspect there, right? Similarly, I think given that I'm out of time, let me end with just one last point. If in fact it's these fundamental forces that are driving what is going on, you also have to worry that if you compress the inequality, if you try and level down, whether in fact it reasserts itself in other ways, that could be costlier. In other words, I'm not saying don't tax the rich. I'm not saying that if you tax the very rich, they will suddenly stop working and go on strike and you won't be able to get tax revenues. But I'm saying when you start taxing certain segments of the society, it will have allocational effects. People will stop going into those areas. Well, you might think it's good to tax the financial sector. We don't want so many people in finance. But how are you going to make those decisions where you want people? Do you want fewer doctors? Because as you tax more, you may get fewer people going to become doctors. In fact, they may all go like France and become bureaucrats. Do you want more bureaucrats in this country, or do you want more small business people, as David Johnston talked about? It's not as simple as the Republicans put it, but it's a question that we have to answer at the same time as we're devising solutions.
Thanks very much, Raghu. Our final speaker is Jeffrey Sachs, professor at Columbia, who you probably all know, and one of the contributors to the volume. He's obviously written very widely on poverty and inequality. And over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much. You know, at the beginning of the week, there was an article, a pretty typical one, in the Financial Times detailing how 3 senior Angolan officials owned a large beneficial share of a private oil company involved in oil development in Angola. And then the next line reminded us that that company was owned by Goldman Sachs. Just about every week we have another crime of Goldman Sachs. And whether it is the financial crimes of Abacus, or whether it was 2 weeks ago fines that Goldman is paying for having breached the barriers between its analysts and its traders, or whether it's this one, which isn't counted as a crime, but surely is a crime in ethical terms, if not legal terms, and corruption under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. We have really quite a display, and it's not just Goldman, it's every firm on Wall Street in the marquee label, and it's something that's really a deep puzzle. It's why the kids were completely right in Occupy Wall Street, and can't be past tense, because we're going to explode if we don't solve these problems one way or another. Now, I think the diagnosis is not such an easy one, and it's certainly not one that can be left to economists, because the problems are much deeper than that. Part of it is globalization and a race to the bottom, and a fact that the powerful countries, the US and the UK in particular, have created an unbelievable mosaic of tax havens and tax shelters and gamesmanship of the sort that Cobalt is one tiny example. And believe me, all the money moving around the world in hot money, it's all known, it's all allowed. It's not hot in the sense, it's just politically agreed. And if one of our 2 presidential candidates, at least one of our 2, has money in the Caymans and Swiss bank accounts, you can be pretty sure we're in a pervasive environment in which This is how the system works. Second is the deregulation and CEO-led governance of the last 30 years that Reagan really amplified. I don't think it's a mystery that doctors are the best paid also. That's not an exception to the rule. That's not about technology. That's about the fact that the AMA and the private health insurers have rigged a system that is about 50% more costly than every other healthcare system in the world, and it's all part of the same process. So this is not an exception to the rule, but a principle of how we operate. We've handed over government to Wall Street, to the private health insurers, to the oil industry, to arms contractors, and so forth. Third, and obviously closely related, is the money in politics is so breathtakingly large that it just makes your head spin. I don't know how many dinners a week President Obama has to have at $35,800 a plate, which is the legal rule for how we can allocate across companies, but that's nothing compared to what's ahead with the $800 million to $1 billion of each of the two campaigns. And where do you think the money's coming from? It ain't coming from the small donors. This is not a grassroots operation. This is just a collapse of any sense of democracy in this country.
5 minutes, Jeff.
Yeah, I think the fourth point is probably the most serious, and that is that we have lost an ethical discourse in this country, and we've lost basic standards. The fact that this is at all complicated is the shock in and of itself. There was a wonderful study in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a couple months ago, which gave tests to subjects allowing them to cheat in various ways. And it showed that the higher the socioeconomic status, the more cheating was done. This is a crisis of the elite. You better be sure about it. And it's a crisis of the elite that's pretty widespread. We have lost our moral compass in this country. And the people that we have gone to school with, that I have taught, that I've had as colleagues, that I meet every day in my work, I'm sorry, we have a serious elite ethical crisis in this country that is absolutely not even part of our radar screen in some sense, except when it's brought to our attention by kids camping out in a small park. And that's so terrifying to the elite that they eventually have to send in the police rather than 2 porta-johnies to keep it safe. The idea that that was a public health hazard that closed down Zuccotti Park, dream again. This was a public relations hazard that closed down Zuccotti Park. And it's because it was drawing attention to the pervasiveness of our psychological and ethical catastrophe. We have lost trust in society. Government is being asphyxiated. There is a loss of compassion in any part of our political discourse. It's on both parties, though the Republican Party is obviously completely off the cliff. And the Democrats know that they've lost it, so they wring their hands as they cut government to bits. The Republicans do it with glee. That's the only difference. Both parties are taking us over the edge. We're now fighting food stamp cuts, Medicaid cuts, education cuts, healthcare cuts, all the things that Raju just said are so important. All of that's being cut, slashed, decimated right now. And we don't understand morally and ethically how this will rip our society apart. And it would be a good idea to take a look at some places that actually work in the world still, because there are some places that are normal. We're not normal. Sweden's normal, Denmark's normal. They're actually normal. And they actually invest in their kids, and they don't have them grow up in poverty, and they don't break the law all the time, and they're not absolutely insanely looking for the 10th billion dollars if they have the first 9 billion. And they're not pressing for tax cuts all the time, and they don't think that you have to decimate the tax system to have a functioning society. Quite the opposite. And they show up as the happiest people, the longest life expectancy, the most social trust, the most honest government. They're doing exactly the opposite of what the United States is doing right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm going to, thanks to everybody, excellent presentations. I'm going to turn it over to the audience just to get things going and give you a chance to think about what questions you want to ask. I'll just ask one, which is an old journalistic standby. We've heard lots of suggestions about what should be done. Obviously, we can't do everything. If you had to pick one specific policy change or initiative that could affect the issues we've been talking about, rising inequality, etc., perhaps you could just explain it in, 30 seconds, and we'll just go down the line. David?
Just one, huh?
Just one. And quick.
I think I would restore the right to organize for unions so that we get a balance between working people and the very high-end economic elites in the rules we set in our society.
Very good, thank you. Martin?
This is really tough. Well, the thing I wrote about mostly recently in the British context is would be very severe spending limits in politics.
Thank you, very good. Bethany?
Mine is impossible, but I would restore a broader sense of responsibility that I think has been lost, where people in the heights of power who take advantage of all this country has to offer also feel a larger sense of obligation as a result.
Thank you. Raghu?
Well, this is based on the fact that even the 90th percentile of the income distribution, which is everybody in this room, is running away from the 50th percentile. So my proposal is education for the 50th percentile. Education, education, education. Let's spend more on that.
Professor Solow?
Hard, but I'll go with Martin Wolf. If we could repeal Citizens United or get public financing of elections or something like that, I think that's the place to start.
Thanks very much. Jeff?
I think public financing is most important, but my second one is healthcare, the lack of healthcare, the increasingly poor quality of healthcare, the inaccessibility of healthcare, and the total cost of healthcare will be the most important issue doing America in the future. I would like to see a Medicare for All plan that actually begins to control healthcare costs. It's been talked about for a long time. It's still a long way off, but it is a practical solution.
Thanks. Jeff?
I agree with all of those, but I would like us each in our leadership capacities to go out to try to reinvigorate a discussion in our society about honesty, altruism, and fairness.
Okay, thanks very much. Excellent suggestions. Okay, questions from the audience. House rules, they have to be questions, not statements, and please keep them brief. So, gentleman here.
I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Buffett rule, notion of it, if it's merely a diversion or if it's more in its symbolism about the problem of inequality.
Okay, obviously everybody can't answer every question. Do you have anybody you'd particularly like to direct it to?
I don't know if anyone's passionate about
Buffett rule.
It's 2 percentage points higher than Ronald Reagan's tax rate. So to oppose it is, I suppose, to oppose also Reagan's tax policy. It doesn't address the real fundamental problem, which is that we tax wage earners very efficiently and effectively. But we have 2 tax systems in America, separate and unequal. And the other system is for people who control the reporting of their income, business owners, investors, particularly international level people. And many of them I've documented legally do not pay taxes while enjoying billion-dollar size incomes. It's not difficult to do, and there are court records and things that establish there are people who've done this.
Okay, anybody else got strong views on the Buffett rule? No, it doesn't look like it.
If I may say so from outside, it's obviously a diversion.
Lady there, yeah.
My concern is how you mobilize the public to vote to change any of these things that people have talked about. And I would also like to mention that there is a move in the New York State legislature about campaign finance reform in New York State. And everyone should call the governor, the leader of the House, and the Senate, the State House and Senate, to indicate their support for that. Because this bill has been introduced for 30 years, never gets past the Senate.
Thank you. Perhaps Jeff Sachs, you've been involved with more public mobilizing people than probably other people on the panel. How would you answer that question?
Well, first, let's remember that Occupy Wall Street within 1 month drew attention to issues that had been ignored for 20 years. And that's why they had to chase the kids out of the parks.
Right.
And we need to understand this touches a nerve across American society. And so they were very clever. I never would have thought occupying a tiny little park that's an insignificant speck in Google Earth would have meant anything. But we should understand how close we are to a complete contagion of feeling about all of this, because there is such unhappiness and such gamesmanship, and the 99% rings so true to most of this country that this will continue, and this is going to be the way eventually to make change. Now, my own view, just one more moment, is right now we have two political parties that are, one is center-right, that's the Democrats, and one is extreme right. And we have nobody even center, much less center-left right now, because they all feed at the same trough. And we're going to need in 2016 a true center-left party that is not taking big campaign contributions and is campaigning on the basis that they're the only not bought part of the American system. And I think that that's actually going to be possible to jujitsu the system by saying we're the ones that aren't corrupted, they're the ones that are.
Thank you very much. Gentleman at the back.
I'd love to hear what John Cassidy didn't say.
Well, the question's about what role do I think Occupy Wall Street is going to play in this year's election. Just reiterating what some of the other panelists have already said, I mean, I think the most striking thing is how much impact he's already had. If you go back to last summer and spring, the president was still very much talking about deficit reduction, basically following, a sort of neoclassical economic line that we had to reduce the deficit, the markets wouldn't allow any more expansion, etc. Once the Occupy movement started, what happened is the sort of liberal base of the party said, we're not going to take this anymore. These kids are out here, they're getting a lot more support. Clearly they're appealing to some, not just left-wing parts of the American public. Opinion polls showed that 50-60% of the American public expressed support for at least the aspirations, if not the tactics, of Occupy Wall Street. I think the White House quickly saw what was going on, and they thought, look, this is a good way of mobilizing the base, but also appealing to some centrist voters. And the White House did a quick pirouette last fall, starting out with the president's speech in Osawatomie, Kansas, where he invoked Teddy Roosevelt, and then going on through the State of the Union speech, where he raised the prospect of perhaps raising taxes on the rich, and then segueing into his proposal of the Buffett rule. I take Martin's point that, and David's point that it's actually a very sort of weak policy from an economic perspective, but I think it does have some symbolic importance in that it is the first time since Clinton in the early 90s that an American politician has sort of seriously talked about raising taxes at the upper end of the distribution. So I think to that extent, Occupy Wall Street's already played a role in the campaign. Where it'll go from here, I just don't know. Obviously, the Republicans will try and exploit it, painting Obama as an old-fashioned tax and spend liberal. The president is taking something of a risk, even by, proposing such a modest tax increase. I hope it plays out in his favor, but we'll just have to see. Next question. Chap at the front.
I'm wondering if anyone on the panel would like to talk about the surveillance society that we are becoming with the New York City Police Department working with the CIA and the internet intrusion and privacy.
Okay, thank you. We're mostly economists and financial journalists on the panel, but is anybody exercised about that issue?
Well, I'm the guy who exposed the LAPD's worldwide spying operation. A state which has to surveil all of its citizens and listen to their phone calls is not a stable state.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Chap in the corner there.
Yeah, I feel like the lack of media coverage might be part of the issue. I think the more educated people get, the better they tend to make choices that benefit the many rather than the few. Is there some role that the media somehow can step up a little bit about what's really going on behind the scenes?
Okay, journalists on the panel, any views on that? I mean, I would say Occupy Wall Street hasn't exactly been starving for coverage in the last 6 months, but you're right. Before that, obviously, there wasn't that much coverage of inequality issues. Anybody?
Well, no, I think that's a good point. I think financial journalism has been remiss in many areas. For example, it was a very big supporter of financial deregulation in the 1990s when the last remnant of Glass-Steagall was undone in 1999, so Sandy Weill could consume Citicorp and become this giant institution, which he thought allowed him to leverage endlessly because he had diversified his risk so much. The New York Times wrote a very strong editorial in favor of Sandy Weill and the end of Glass-Steagall, and it's kind of ridiculed ideas that consumers would maybe not be safe in that kind of conglomerate, adopting a kind of Milton Friedman line, the competition would keep them safe. I just bring that up as one example. I do not think, I think the financial press has done much better in the last couple of years, but I think in the climb or the descent to this catastrophe, it's often been remiss. It's been much too respectful. We had a little discussion about this at a former conference last week or so.
Okay,
it's been much too respectful of Wall Street and the assumption that Wall Street makes intelligent decisions even in their own self-interest.
20 years ago in this country, there were 20% more PR people than journalists. There are now 3.5 times as many PR people as journalists. And I assure you that anybody who doesn't toe the line gets mau-maued by corporate America. AT&T at one point assigned a vice president solely to police a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle. There's a writer in Corpus Christi at the local paper there who every time he wrote a story, 11 executives from the local electric utility in Houston would be on his editors and publisher complaining.
Thanks. Jeff?
Could I say something? I think there's something deeper here than PR and all that. During the Republican primary campaign, there were ordinary people quoted as saying, "Keep the government out of my Medicare." There are millions of voters in this country who do not regard Medicare as a government program. What you do about that kind of invincible ignorance, I don't know. But I do think that Mr. Obama's best friend in this campaign is Paul Ryan. I think that it's possible to go for those preserve those non-government programs like Social Security and Medicare, and hang a lot of political campaigning on
Thanks.
that.
Martin Wolf, then Jeff Sachs, and then we'll move on.
I mean, obviously, since I work in this business, I ought to have views on it. I was on the other side with Jeff on this discussion a week ago, so it seems permanent. There are so many failings. I have to admit that when I was sitting in London writing my economics columns in the late 1990s and thinking about all that was going on in the world, the Asian financial crisis, the insane stock market bubble, and all the rest of it, it didn't occur to me that the repeal of Glass-Steagall would turn out to be a huge thing. And so, first of all, you miss things. You miss things. Second, there aren't very many people involved in the financial press, and the economics commentary associated with it is an extraordinarily small number of people. The number of people doing economics commentary in serious press may be, well, in the UK it's about 5, probably 15 here. I have no idea, but it isn't many, and you miss everything. So I think that I've made this criticism many times, the Americans really expect things from the press that it will never deliver. Even if it were completely honest, competent, and profitable, which at the moment it's none of those three things. So forget the idea that the press will solve this problem. It's a serious delusion. That doesn't mean that good reporters don't make a difference. Of course they do. They make an extraordinary difference, but they're not going to fix this problem. Now, Bob seems to me to have touched the real issue, which is the way in a democratic society, the wider society is informed about the nature of the issues they confront. It seems to me as an outsider, and I've been thinking a great deal about what lessons we should learn from what's happening in the US, that one of the things that's happened here is there is no means to have a national conversation politically. Essentially, even when I lived here in the 70s, I'm sorry, slightly, there were still networks. Now there is no means of having a national conversation. So I have concluded that the most important single media thing that preserves something like a democratic order in the UK, and I would stress something like, I am well aware of the weaknesses, is the fact there's a BBC and every politician has to appear on it and they have to respond to one another on it. They can't go off into their echo chambers, and I don't know how you fix that.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
I think there's another big disconnect, and it's not public opinion, because if you look at actual public opinion over the last 5 years, those in favor of raising taxes on the rich have been 60% or higher. Those in favor of ending the Iraq and Afghanistan wars have been a consistent majority, and those in favor of preserving social spending have been a consistent majority. It's actually not public opinion that's the real breakdown here. It's the link from public opinion to outcomes in policy. Don't think that the parties are competing on the basis of public opinion. This is like non-price competition of two banks across the street from each other who give away toasters or something. Both parties are in collusion on core policies. Both parties are aligned around a very narrow range. That's why there was no change after 2008. Why it's not that there's no difference, I don't want to exaggerate. The Republican Party is beyond my imagination in its nastiness and so forth. So I do want to say there's a difference. But the Democratic Party is unrecognizable from the old Republican Party. And the truth is, they're not competing on the things that the public cares about right now. The public wants higher taxes on the rich. It will not happen because both parties at the core resist and are divided internally, even the Democrats. And I know it because I've seen it in the White House on days that decisions were being taken. And this is not what it looks like, that it's battling for the center of public opinion. Public opinion is here, the parties are to the right, and we do not have a democratic process. We have a duopoly. And the duopoly is not even hitting the median voter. It's hitting the right because that's where the money is in this system. And that's why we need a third party and why we have to take that seriously.
No, I don't think that's quite right, Jeff. I don't want to whitewash the Democratic Party at all, but even when it comes to taking a little, the Democratic Party is anxious to keep, to drop the Bush tax cut for the upper incomes.
Yeah.
The Republicans are not. You can't get that. So it's not simply a matter of the parties collaborating. There is, I think you put your finger on it at the beginning, there is this problem of translating what public opinion appears to be into votes in the Congress and in the presidential elections as well. But there is a major difference in the parties, and a good deal of what looks like collaboration is this attempt, this failed attempt, I will agree, to compromise and get something.
Bob, just a quick point. In the 2010 extension of the Bush tax cuts, the opinion polls were running very strongly in favor of repealing the rate at the top.
Exactly.
The president did not campaign for that publicly, although he supported it, but he didn't go out to the public for it. And one of the reasons was the Democratic Party itself was deeply divided internally. They did not want to have that fight. And so he couldn't even, I don't know where his real feelings were, but his political advisors told him, don't go there. I happened to be in the White House the day the agreement was struck. It was very odd to see almost glee of what I thought was the most shocking agreement the Democrats have signed on to in a generation or more. but it was not viewed unhappily. It was viewed as, well, we did pretty well. We've got a part stimulus because the tax cut remains in place. And it was viewed as a kind of stimulus continuation rather than what it was the beginning of gutting what remains of our government. Now, I don't want to personalize it to the president, but I do want to stay on the Democratic Party. There was no front of the Democratic Party to side with public opinion. Half of the congressional Democratic Party was against any fight on this issue.
And Professor Solow, I have to disagree with you too, because the 2001 tax bill raised taxes on 51 million Americans, the poorest 51 million, and it lowered taxes on the top 2% of workers. That suggests that the Democrats are, in fact, as Jeffrey Sachs says, the party of the right center.
Okay, thanks. Two more questions and then we'll wrap it up. Chuck, here, you have his hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to follow on from that. And I don't know if I'm oversimplifying this.
Very good question, please.
Is this not just the fault of government, the failure of those governments? It seems like all these decisions, and we seem to be pointing fingers at Wall Street, but I mean, Wall Street does what they do, and our social contract gives us no right to over Wall Street, but it does give us a right over government. But government appears to be not doing their job.
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, lady in front.
I want to ask a question about education financing reform. California, for a moment, some other universities toyed about an idea about allowing students to repay their debt once they got a job, but through the university. And I was wondering if any of you had any thoughts on if there's going to be any education refinance reform for the upcoming years, either state, university, or federal level.
So Jeff, Madrick, I think you expressed interest in education reform, didn't you? You want to take that one?
Sadly, I did not hear the question. Sorry. Bob and I are in the same camp. We didn't hear the question.
I'm different than he is, but never mind.
Martin?
But I'm older than you.
I just wanted to say that this may be of direct relevance because we've had a huge national debate in the UK. We've adopted a system which I think was also used in Australia, which I actually think is rather good. That is to say, we have largely, though not entirely, not to the same levels, liberalised, allowed universities to charge fees. The ceiling is currently £9,000 a year, which admittedly by many American standards is rather low, probably enough. But the crucial thing is everybody who goes to university has tuition free. There is a loan system which is run by the state, the only insurance system that can take it on, and it's repaid on an income contingent basis. So you repay over your lifetime depending on how much you earn. At the moment, the interest rate is subsidized, so it's close to zero. I think it should be the long-term government bond rate, and I think that sort of system will be close to self-financing. It does require that some of the people who are most successful pay on a present value basis better, somewhat more than their fees. Essentially, you collectivize it and you eliminate the tuition penalty. Obviously, this is completely inconceivable in the US. But it does allow universities, including our best universities, to charge fees, to have that freedom without it having any direct effect on the cost for students. There are political problems with it, but I think it is a really rather a sensible sort of reform.
Raghu, you've been talking about education.
I think this is a nice idea, but there are always pitfalls in any idea. And one of the problems we've seen in the United States is with some availability of financing for education, especially at the higher level, the private sector saw that as an opportunity, and you've got all these for-profit colleges opening up, going after people who have access to these loans and getting them into degrees which have absolutely no value whatsoever. So you have to be a little careful that you do it in a way that people actually come out of it with productive degrees that they can actually use. And so this is more complicated than just financing. We need to figure out how to get that information to people so that they can make good choices. And there's some regulation of this process so that you don't have people going out and suckering young students. Somebody made a comment earlier about the 17-year-old or 18-year-old young employee. We should worry about students also, that they don't commit their life to servitude on the basis of judgments when they didn't know anything about what they should do.
John, I will just say a couple of quick things, if you don't mind. I think as difficult as the problems are in higher education, and we do have a kind of Wall Street system now in private universities, people chasing fancy professors at very high salaries, for example, just as if they were Wall Street traders. But the real problem, Bob Solow just said wishful thinking to me, but wishful thinking. But we have to keep in mind the real problem in America is extremely unequal education between K and 12. And a really poor, by any modern nation standard, a really poor, accessible pre-K system. Inaccessible. And that's really where we have to devote our energies. There are problems. The student loan problems are serious. The most serious problem is you get out of college and you have very high unemployment rates for 20-somethings these days for that group. But we have very unequal financing of K through 12 throughout America. And I don't think financing alone will be the issue. But that is one of the 2 or 3 major problems we face.
Okay, Jeff Sachs?
I was going to say the same thing, but emphasize the 0 to K, which is that the decent societies know to take care of the children from birth onward. And the biggest thing that the social democracies do is ensure that early childhood means safety, nutrition, safe childcare, cognitive stimulation, preschool, so that all kids from any part of society come to school ready to learn. We lose our kids even by K in this country. And we are the only high-income society allowing a substantial proportion of its children to grow up in abject poverty and to come to school not ready to learn. And it's the biggest shame of all on our society because it's a tiny, tiny amount. And that's why the immorality of what the rich are doing in this country and Wall Street is doing is so high, because for so little we could save our kids, and we're not doing it.
Thanks, Bethany.
There's a sentiment in a lot of quarters that the student loan crisis is the next subprime mortgage crisis, and there are lots and lots of reasons why I think that's absolutely right. And that's the key reason that we should be having a debate about this now and a conversation about what to do about education finance now, although I think a lot of the losses are already baked in the cake. But we should start talking about it now instead of after the fact, as we did in the housing crisis. And in fact, the two are linked, because we won't have a recovery in the housing market unless people can go out and buy new houses, and if they're too saddled with student loans to do that, the whole thing is interconnected in a very frightening way.
Okay, any more questions? Chap in the back corner there. We'll go till 5:15. I think there may be drinks. Is there drinks on offer afterward, 5:15 to 5:30? We need some drinks if you want.
I'd like to address this to Professor Rajan and Mr. McLean. So there's some evidence there's a correlation between income inequality and poor economic performance in terms of average wage growth or probability of financial crisis. Is this positive, or is it just a symptom of something else, like people taking out money from their home equity?
So I don't think that's some baked-in fact. I think some crises, income inequality can contribute to. I don't think it's some people went out and tried to test it. I don't think it's necessarily baked in. I do think that there are reactions to income inequality which are less useful than others. For example, trying to paper over income inequality by making access to credit easy can create more of a problem down the line as you get over-indebted people. And my colleagues, Marianne Bertrand and Adair Morse, have shown that in the districts in the United States where you have more income inequality, you have more distress amongst low-income people because they're trying to keep up with the Jones by consuming more, and what enables them to consume more has been more access to credit. So there are circumstances where it can be exacerbated by the wrong kind of solution. My preference is, rather than focusing on necessarily leveling down, let's level up. Let's get more people above the hurdle. And some of that may require more taxes and more spending, but let's put the focus squarely on getting everybody a better job than they have today.
I really have to respond to that. Some idea that all this borrowing at low income levels has been in order to live the good life if that was the implication Professor Rajan was making, is simply not true. When you have wages that have stagnated for men, median male wages are the same today after inflation as they were in 1969. If you take the same group of males, because so many fewer have full-time jobs today, it's actually fallen between 15 to 25%. In that kind of environment, people borrowed to make ends meet. They didn't borrow to buy a Porsche. Some did, obviously. Some lived very well. But let's keep clear, we live in a low-wage society for most people these days. Borrowing, and I think Professor Rajan made this point in his book, Flowlands, borrowing enabled people to, in my view, keep their heads above water and reduce political pressure to get wages up. But this has been this is not all fun and games, this borrowing.
Just quickly, I wasn't implying it was fun and games. I was just stating a fact that in the districts where there was more inequality, where there was more spending by the upper income people, there was also more spending by lower income people. You can call that, prices were higher in those areas. They had to spend more to keep their head above water. You can argue they were keeping up with the Joneses. That's the title of the paper, by the way. It doesn't matter. The fact is they spent more. And they spent more by financing it by borrowing because median incomes weren't growing. And so the problem I'm arguing was the easy access to credit, whether it be credit cards being predatory here or any other sources of finance. And we have to worry about that in these kinds of environments, that you don't want a debt crisis being put over and above the income crisis that you already have.
You're touching a raw nerve with me. Keeping up with the Joneses is not the same as keeping your head above water.
I didn't say it was. I just told you there were two interpretations of it, and I just stated the fact as they claimed it was.
Okay, thanks, guys. Next question. Chap here.
Yes, youth discontent in the last year or two is not just a U.S. phenomenon. We've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in the Middle East. So are there common drivers for all this youth discontent, and can there be common goals?
Excellent question. The international aspects of this. Who would like to start on that one? Martin?
Okay, this is heroic. But anyway, I'm an international journalist. I'd be interested in Jeff's view. I think there is something that links them, though the social contexts are very different, the political contexts are very different. And I'm not going to talk about the technologies that allow this possible. I think for different reasons in different societies, we have produced, and this perhaps goes back to Europe in the 19th century, 1848, we have in common that we have produced a very large number of young people, often educated young people, at least to some significant degree, relative to the sorts of jobs they can aspire to, who are aware of the opportunities of the modern world, and who are aware that their lives look very, very bleak in those terms, in many different ways. Either they can get no employment at all, and take Spain, youth unemployment in Spain currently is nearly 50%. We're not talking about Egypt, where I'm sure it looks much grimmer. So, and it seems to me that if you look at the way many societies have been structured and organized, it is the young have been very significantly disadvantaged. So it's not surprising, despite all the differences, there is a common resentment about the way life is stacked against them. Where that leads one, in political terms, and it's really the only other point, what is so interesting to me is that certainly in the Arab world, something happened, though what's going to emerge out of that isn't clear. In Europe, it doesn't yet seem that anything very much is going to happen, but it might. The French elections are going to be really interesting. And in the US, the results are so perverse that I find it absolutely impossible to understand. But that's another matter.
Okay.
The contributing causes seem to me to have some things in common.
Raghu?
Two things. One, across the world, if you look at income inequality, I would bet income inequality is coming down because the poorer countries are getting richer. More people in those countries are getting richer. The number of Chinese, the number of Indians who are crossing the poverty line will, for the world as a whole, bring down inequality. At the same time, within those countries, as well as within industrial countries, income inequality is probably rising. So this goes back to Martin's earlier point. Some of the reasons for income inequality rising in industrial countries is globalization, open trade, et cetera, et cetera. In order to prevent this, do you actually make poorer people in India and in China not increase their wealth? In other words, you could start becoming protectionist, but that could actually result in lower gains elsewhere and therefore higher income inequality for the world. How do you put these two one against the other? That's actually a question which is going to trouble us in the years to come.
Anybody else have anything on that one? Yep, Jeff.
Yeah, I wrote about the question in my chapter contribution and pointed out that some of the places where the unrest and demonstrations were the largest were a little bit unexpected. Israel, for example, where 500,000 people turned out on the streets. Chile, relatively successful from a macro point of view, but incredibly unequal. Very, very high levels of inequality. And that has driven a lot of the protests everywhere. And the inequality within countries has been rising, and it's been very high in certain places, the United States and others. Globalization pressures inequality in many places, but the key then is how the political system reacts to it. In the US, it amplified inequality. It helped the rich, cut the taxes, slashed benefits at the bottom, amplified, unleashed CEO compensation, et cetera, et cetera. In other countries, there were compensatory actions taken to lean against these pressures to make sure that everybody could keep a foothold in the society. The more social democratic countries, the more social market economies. And where the explosions were very, very visible and often quite surprising were the high unequal societies.
Okay, thanks. One more last question. Chap at the back.
Hi, good afternoon. We've been talking about the economics of Occupy Wall Street, and no one so far has sort of addressed some of the core economic principles that are coming out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, or alternative economics. And so I'd really like to hear about that, and also just to hear a little bit about, like, you know, part of the reason this movement came about was because people were frustrated that politicians couldn't be responsive and people took it into their own hands. So I guess I just wanted to voice some frustration with, like, the political discourse, and I'd like to hear more about, like, the people power aspect of things.
People power. Anybody got views on people power?
Reform begins with you. That's the number one thing to keep in mind. It doesn't begin with politicians. It doesn't begin with people sitting up here on the platform. You want to change the society, then go change it. Reform begins with you.
Anybody else?
Well, you know, OWS has changed the society. So, and I presume you're part of that movement. It's been an extraordinary success, well beyond anything anybody could have expected. So I think all those arguments will continue to be heard. The nature of this conversation would not be the same without OWS. I am pretty sure the Citigroup shareholders would not have voted down the pay package for the CEO and top managers yesterday as they did. Shockingly good news, had there been no OWS. So something indeed is going on. One thing that does get lost in this panel on economics, and it comes back to the question you raised about civil rights, we tend to think that OWS simply got kicked out of Zuccotti. There were lots of preemptive arrests. There were lots of artificial arrests. There was lots of herding, Herding. There were lots of kids beaten with club sticks and dragged around. We should keep this in mind about our democracy and what's been tolerated. We know what happened in Oakland. We know what happened at UC Davis with the pepper spray. I think all of that is quite distressing and again says something about democracy. And to the extent OWS made it clear that that kind of thing's possible in America, it's another achievement of OWS.
Jeff, yeah?
I want to agree with Jeff, but also disagree with him. I want to agree with the sentiment, but disagree with the change yet having happened. Even yesterday's vote under the bizarre corporate law that we have is advisory. The shareholders say we don't like this. The board says, okay, we hear you, but it doesn't mean anything necessarily changes. That's how strange it is, this insider game of CEO weak corporate governance that American corporations have. OWS was an amazing burst of energy and sentiment, and it was pushed away, and nothing's been won yet, in my opinion, nothing. And we have government that continues to decline, continues to be squeezed, would be ripped to shreds if a Republican president wins, will just be gradually asphyxiated if a Democratic president wins. In both paths, we have not changed direction in this country yet. And when you talk about people power, it has to be in institutions in many parts of society, and I think it hasn't happened yet. I'd start also inside corporations. Yesterday's vote is very significant. I don't want to deny that. But the weight of power in our companies is so CEO dominated compared to any other place where in a high income democracy, that they have run away with the power, the money, the ownership, the control, the rights, and there is no countervailing pressure inside yet. That's what co-determination or other company law reforms in Northern Europe, which puts stakeholder responsibility in and so forth, or large-scale unionization coverage, which obviously the United States is at the complete opposite end of the spectrum, brings about. We don't have the countervailing power yet in our country, neither in the political parties nor inside the companies, nor I would say inside the society. So don't think it's a one battle yet. It was a dramatic burst, but I think that we're still very much on the back foot in this country.
I want to say something a little more pessimistic than that. First of all, we have to face it. When the historian of the future comes to look at our time and the political changes, it's not going to be so simple to say whatever change in opinion there was occurred because of the OWS movement. You know, a financial meltdown and a long, deep recession also has effects on public opinion. And I'm inclined to count a little more on that to make things, to drive home to people that that something is wrong. And I'm also, I'm afraid, prepared to be thankful for small favors. And if the next Congress has 20 or 30 fewer Republicans in the House of Representatives, and maybe one or two more Democrats in the Senate, and a Democratic president, I will go to bed happier, a lot happier than if it doesn't.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. On that note, I'd like to thank the panel and everybody for coming. Fascinating discussion.